Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program. Very, very busy Friday. As you can see, we're live right now in the Claudia Herrig case out of Ohio. The forensic pathologist is on the stand. Before we jump in there and talk about this trial, I do want to let you know I am keeping a very careful eye on the Jason Van Dyke feed because we were live there earlier today. It is the sentencing of this officer who was found guilty of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery in connection with the shooting death of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. Earlier today, the judge heard the arguments from both the state and the defense about what the sentence should be. The state said that he should be sentenced both on second-degree murder and the 16 counts of aggravated battery, but those sentences can be served concurrently at the same time. However, the 16 counts of battery should be served consecutively, one after another. Now, he doesn't have to be sentenced on all 16, but at the very minimum, they said 2. The defense said he should only be sentenced on one count, second-degree murder. We're waiting to see what the judge will ultimately come back with. The fate of that man is in the judge's hands. Now, Claudia Herrig, we're live in this courtroom. She has been charged with the murder of her husband by allegedly shooting him back in March of 2007. She then fled to Brazil, was extradited back to the United States. We're live in this courtroom. Let's go live right now. Okay, already exciting start. Let's get some perspective. Law enforcement expert Vincent Hill, I want to go to you first. What did you think?
Well, Jesse, there's always two sides to every story. We heard the previous testimony where he says he was the victim of this unwarranted traffic stop. Then we heard the other side from the defense. And here's the thing, Jesse, as many people don't want to believe it, people will lie on the police. Now, I'm not saying that this didn't happen, but you saw how this went on cross-examination of that witness. Where were these racial slurs in that report if it happened on that traffic stop?
It's a good question. I'm also here with trial attorney Jennifer Schuster. Big day for the defense. How they doing so far, Jennifer?
I think the defense is doing a good job. I can't understand why the prosecution would call this witness when the defense pointed out that this witness omitted the two most salacious, most memorable allegations from his complaint. So I think the defense is doing a very effective job here on cross-examination. Yeah,
we saw already today the prosecution and the defense battling it out in terms of what the sentence should ultimately be. We're hearing some other testimony from the court. I'm just waiting for the green light to go. Yes, okay, so let's go back live into the courtroom right now.
All right, so that was the second witness being presented by the prosecution. And again, this is the sentencing phase of the defendant who's been convicted of second-degree murder, Jason Van Dyke. And so they are presenting witnesses from the state's perspective to say aggravated circumstances when it comes down to the sentencing. So we're going to have another witness, I think, coming into court, and we've got the attorney ready. Let's listen and see if the next third witness is ready on the stand. Join our special guests. We have Vincent Hill, law enforcement, who's been with us, but also Jennifer Schuster, trial attorney, is also with us. So let's talk to both of you. First of all, let me ask, watching that, Jennifer, let me ask you, to me it felt very pro-defense because the credibility of this witness, I think, is questioned by the fact he got convicted of a DUI that night, and the only thing he can really remember and say is, I was choked. What do you think?
Sure, absolutely. This witness has motivation to lie about Officer Van Dyke's conduct because he was facing DUI charges and, in fact, was convicted of a DUI. He pleaded guilty to those. And I think the defense's overarching argument will be that these witnesses, both this one and the one before, are on a mission to help deliver the most severe penalty possibly available to Officer Van Dyke.
All right, so we're going to return to court and see what evidence and testimony they're presenting. All right, so here we are listening to the third witness. Vince, I have to pull you in, though, on the second witness in the sentencing phase of Van Dyke. The witness testified he blew a .08, but he also testified I had one shot of vodka and then blew a .08. Is that possible?
Not in this lifetime, unless he had that one shot of vodka right before he got in the car after having about 5 beers and 2 more shots of vodka just an hour before. But one shot of vodka, Ashley, is not going to make you blow over the legal limit, .08. It's impossible.
And so do you think really quickly that the jury knows that?
I don't think the jury knows that. They may, depending on, if they drink themselves. But, I mean, common sense will tell you that limited amount of alcohol is not going to push you over the legal limit.
Okay. So thank you, Vince. We are going to take a break. We are going to be returning to this trial. You won't want to miss the witnesses testifying in the sentencing phase. We'll be right back after this break. All right, that was the end of the examination of the third witness. Vince and I, we've been talking on breaks, and I know you're chomping at the bit to give us what you think about these witnesses and the fact that they've testified, yes, they broke a law, or they were convicted of breaking a law, or in the third victim's witness's case, just got out of jail. Well, what's your opinion of all this?
Well, actually, it's quite clear here. Listen, we know this case is racially motivated. We know that for a fact. So what the prosecution is doing is putting on every black face they can that was ever encountered with Jason Van Dyke and filed a complaint. But here's the thing. Each has said, yes, I did this. Yes, I was drunk. Yes, I rolled a stop sign. So all the traffic stops were legal. It had nothing to do with race. Police were out doing their job. Jason Van Dyke was with a partner. And let's be clear here. Although I've said I didn't agree with the shooting of Laquan McDonald, we can clearly see what this is. And I assure you, Jason Van Dyke only didn't stop black people in the city of Chicago with a population that has a large majority of white people. I assure you, there's some white people that probably complained against Jason Van Dyke, not because it was racial, but because maybe they just didn't like the encounter they had with him. But it's clear what the state is doing here.
All right, so Jennifer, let me ask you, do you think that the jury is going to look at that cumulative evidence of repeated reports by different witnesses, or are they going to do what Vince suggests and see right through this and say, all right, the credibility of this witness doesn't exist, and this is a racially motivated reason for the state calling these witnesses in the first place?
Sure, I think the judge is absolutely going to see these credibility issues. There are lots of them, but the prosecution is going to say, well, listen, these are the types of folks that Jason Van Dyke interacted with. He was a police officer. Of course, he interacted with primarily criminals on a day-to-day basis out in the field. But again, like you said, Ashley, it's the totality of the circumstances. You take all of these three witnesses together, and they could, the judge may find, point to a pattern and practice of being overly aggressive and abusive.
And I want to point out, thank you, Jennifer, saying the judge, because I inadvertently referred to the jury, because that's what happens during the stage when a defendant's convicted, as Van Dyke was in this case. But it is the judge responsible for the sentencing. So, Vince, let me go back to you and play devil's advocate with you. We do know that the second witness, Jeremy Mayers, did say, hey, he choked me. And then this witness testified, I wasn't happy with the professionalism of the officers. They were verbally abusive. Whether that occurs with a white or a black person or anyone stopped by the police, are those things appropriate?
Well, if you choke someone, no, it's not appropriate. I mean, he did say, yeah, I put the cough drop in to prevent them knowing I was DUI. So, of course, he's trying to conceal evidence of a crime there. And it is a practice in police to try to extract evidence if someone tries to swallow it or whatever. But to be verbally abusive, is it professional? Absolutely not. Is it illegal? No, it's not. So we, as police officers, come across people where sometimes four-letter words will come out of your mouth because you're human. Yes, you're held to a higher standard. But when you're dealing with someone who's resisting, or you're dealing with someone who's being difficult, sometimes those things happen. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad cop. Trust me, I've said four-letter words in policing, but that didn't mean I was a bad cop.
All right. And is it in response to a person's behavior when they're stopped that you find yourself in that position because they're acting out? And if you're intoxicated or stopped and below a .08, arguably your behaviors may not be so great.
Well, not only that, Ashley, I mean, listen, I've worked the black community as well, and people just don't like police. You know, they're not looked upon as to gain respect in the community, and sometimes people just are argumentative, disrespectful to the police. So sometimes when you're dealing with that on a daily basis for 8 hours a day, sometimes those words are going to come out of your mouth. That's just the nature of the beast. It does not make you a bad guy.
Okay, so let's go back into court and listen to the questioning of the next witness. Well, this is terrible to have to listen to and hear. So much we could talk about. But listen, why, Jennifer, did the prosecution not lead with this witness? Because hearing what happened to him, his injuries, and that excessive force by Van Dyke, why wouldn't you start with this testimony?
Well, I think there are a couple of schools of thought when it comes to strategy, and this one being you save the best for last. This witness obviously is credible. He's compelling. And I think somewhat his testimony bolsters the credibility of the preceding three witnesses that had lots of problems. So I think that's the rationale here. But remember, this is a judge listening to all of this testimony, not a jury. And if anything we learned from yesterday, we learned that the judge who was overseeing the trial of those 3 officers who were ultimately acquitted, she had a very different take on this case than the jury did.
Right. So he is having a hard time testifying. You heard at the beginning of his testimony that he was crying, having difficulty. The prosecutor was allowed to ask some leading questions because he was having an emotional time testifying. We are going to take a short break, but please come back. We're going to rejoin and continue covering the Van Dyke sentencing hearing taking place today. All right, so we were listening to testimony by Edward Nance, and I just felt like it was absolutely terrible to listen to, because he describes when he got stopped, pulled out of a car by Van Dyke, handcuffed back on the police car, on his car, dragged across the ground to the police car, thrown in the back on the floor. He described the pain that he said he continued to suffer. Here's what we know. He did file, as he testified to, a civil rights claim, and that included against Van Dyke as a police officer. He won $350,000 and $180,000 separate award for attorney's fees. Vincent Hill, our law enforcement expert, why would he still be employed after an excessive force civil rights suit was won because of his actions?
Well, Ashley, listen, I listened to that testimony and my heart went out to Edward Nance there. And there's no logical reason why Van Dyke was still on that department after 2008 once this went to trial and he was awarded that money. We heard about his injuries. Obviously, I'm sure in court those injuries came out, medical records came out, proved those injuries. I know about handcuffing people. I know if you're not careful with their shoulders because they're already in a backward motion, you can tear rotator cuffs. So why Jason Van Dyke was still employed by the city of Chicago after that trial, Ashley, is way beyond me. I don't understand it at all.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Jennifer, I'd like you to weigh in and talk a little bit about this Edward Nance testifying. He's a Vietnam vet. Did that have any impact? And what do you think about Vince's comments of how is he still on the force?
Yeah, well, I think the defense obviously has a tough job on this cross-examination when you're dealing with a witness who's emotional, but I think they're doing a great job pursuing this line of questioning about his history in the Army, and that, in fact, he experienced some trauma in the Army, and that very well could result in some sort of PTSD or the other ailments he's listing. And it's interesting that the judge in this case is actually a Vietnam vet. So he brings some experience and knowledge to this that lots of judges don't.
So listen, here's some other law and crime breaking news information about this case, and that is, listen, one report said 17, another report said 20. In any event, a number of citizen complaints had been filed against Van Dyke since 2006. Now, I don't know if the prosecution is going to go into all of those for the sentencing hearing or not. We're going to have to stay tuned. But how does that impact the defense, Jennifer, knowing that information?
Well, I think it's important for the defense to point out that most of those complaints resulted in no action against Van Dyke. They were unfounded. There were no criminal proceedings. So I think the defense needs to capitalize on that point. And I think when you look at the totality of all the complaints filed against all police officers in Chicago, I don't know if 20 complaints is just a drop in the bucket. I'd be curious to hear those numbers.
Well, that's a really great point. I do wonder those numbers as well. Now, Vincent, now that you know that, does that add any fuel to the fire, begging the question, why was Jason Van Dyke still working for the police department?
Yeah, I'm not looking at the number 20 and saying, yes, why is he still there? Because to Jennifer's point, people complain on police quite a bit. I got a few complaints that were all unfounded as well. So you have to look at what was founded versus unfounded. But I go back to Edward Nance, and I suffer from PTSD, and I know anything can trigger that at the spur of the moment. And listening to his testimony about how he was thrown in the back of the car and he laid down in the back, I can't understand that at all. That's not police tactics. That's not police training. That is just all out being an abusive cop, if you will. So if it's true and Jason Van Dyke did that, he should have been let go from that department. I don't blame Jason Van Dyke. I blame the leadership in the city of Chicago who did not get rid of him at that point.
Especially when that witness's testimony was, hey, listen, I also filed a complaint. I didn't just do a civil lawsuit. I filed a complaint. And guess what? They did nothing. Van Dyke was not held accountable. Exactly to your point, Vincent. Now, we've talked a little bit, and I know we've talked about, yes, Chicago has a lot of issues with the police, and it was a big deal when the 3 police, we just covered this trial, were charged with conspiracy. Now, they were found not guilty yesterday by a court of any conspiracy charges in covering up the shooting of McDonald by Van Dyke. But that aside, it was a really significant deal that they were even charged by the state based on the evidence that the state could present. So now, how do we think this is going to affect the relationship between police and individuals in Chicago, hearing about details of at least one circumstance where the complaint is backed by a successful civil suit saying there was excessive force? Jennifer, let me ask you first. Do you think it's going to make a difference?
Oh, well, sure. This will continue to be an incredibly racially and politically charged issue here in Chicago. I am in Chicago. There's a mayoral race around the corner, and police reform is one of the top issues in that race. In fact, the former chief of police, Gary McCarthy, who was fired when Laquan McDonald's dash cam video was released, he was fired by the mayor the day that dash cam was released. He, in fact, is running for mayor largely on this ticket that he'll spearhead this necessary police reform and outreach to the community.
You know, and that just bolsters my already standing opinion that one of the reasons it's so important to watch trials live and that Law and Crime fortunately can cover them is because the public needs to know. Everyone needs to see and be transparent about this is what's happening, because I believe that only raises the bar, including in terms of police action. So here's what we're going to do. Everybody in the courtroom has lost the feed, so no one is able to cover the courtroom proceedings currently in Van Dyke's sentencing. As certainly once everyone is able to, we will rejoin watching those proceedings. In the meantime, Edward Nance, such compelling testimony. Let's look back at some of his testimony. I mean, really, to add insult to injury, this witness testified he had multiple shoulder injuries after what happened by Van Dyke. And not only that, he also testified after he had been thrown into the back of the police car, he was pulled out, handcuffs taken off, and Van Dyke said, go on home, get out of here. So it's really just horrible testimony to listen to. But we're not going to want to miss it. Come right back after this break, and we're going to go straight back to sentencing trial.